Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is from chapter 307. Chapter 307. At midday on the 22nd of October, Pierre was going uphill along the muddy, slippery road, looking at his feet and at the roughness of the way. Occasionally he glanced at the familiar crowd around him, and then again at his feet. The former and the latter were alike familiar and his own. The blue-gray bandy-legged dog ran merrily along the side of the road, sometimes in proof of its agility and self-satisfaction, lifting one hind leg and hopping along on three, and then again going on all four and rushing to bark at the crows that sat on the carrion. The dog was merrier and sleeker than it had been in Moscow. All around lay the flesh of different animals, from men to horses, in various stages of decomposition, and as the wolves were kept off by the passing men, the dog could eat all it wanted. It had been raining since morning, and had seemed as if at any moment it might cease and the sky clear, but after a short break it began raining harder than before. The saturated road no longer absorbed the water, which ran along the ruts and streams. Pierre walked along, looking from side to side, counting his steps in threes, and reckoning them off with his fingers. Mentally addressing the rain, he repeated, now then, go on, pelt harder." It seemed to him that he was thinking of nothing, but far down and deep within him his soul was occupied with something important and comforting. This something was a most subtle spiritual deduction from a conversation with Karatsiev the day before. At their yesterday's halting place, feeling chilly by a dying campfire, Pierre had got up and gone to the next one, which was burning better. There Platon Karatsiev was sitting covered up, head and all, with his greatcoat, as if it were a vestment, telling the soldiers in his effective and pleasant, though now feeble voice, a story Pierre knew. It was already past midnight, the hour when Karatsiev was usually free of his fever and particularly lively. When Pierre reached the fire and heard Platon's voice enfeebled by illness, and saw his pathetic face brightly lit up by the blaze, he felt a painful prick at his heart. His feeling of pity for this man frightened him, and he wished to go away, but there was no other fire, and Pierre sat down, trying not to look at Platon. "Well, how are you?" he asked. "How am I? If we grumble at sickness, God won't grant us death," replied Platon, and at once resumed the story he had begun. "And so, brother," he continued, with a smile on his pale, emaciated face, and a particularly happy light in his eyes. "You see, brother." Pierre had long been familiar with that story. Karatsiev had told it to him alone some half-dozen times, and always with a specially joyful emotion. But well as he knew it, Pierre now listened to that tale as to something new, and the quiet rapture Karatsiev evidently felt as he told it communicated itself also to Pierre. The story was of an old merchant who lived a good and God-fearing life with his family, and who went once to the Nisnini fair with a companion, a rich merchant. Having put up at an inn, they both went to sleep, and next morning his companion was found robbed and with his throat cut. A blood-stained knife was found under the old merchant's pillow. He was tied, knouted, and his nostrils having been torn off, all in due form, as Karatsiev put it, he was sent to hard labor in Siberia. And so, brother, it was at this point that Pierre came up. 10 years or more passed by. The old man was living as a convict, submitting as he should and doing no wrong. Only he prayed to God for death. Well, one night the convicts were gathered just as we are here, with the old man among them, and they began telling what each was suffering for, and how they had sinned against God. One told how he had taken a life, another how he had taken two. A third had set a house on fire, while another had simply been a vagrant and had done nothing. So they asked the old man, "What are you being punished for, Daddy?" "I, my dear brother," said he, "am being punished for my own and other men's sins. But I have not killed anyone or taken anything that was not mine, but have only helped my poorer brothers. I was a merchant, my dear brothers, and had much property." And he went on to tell them all about it in due order. "I don't grieve for myself," he says. "God, it seems, has chastened me. Only I am sorry for my old wife and children." And the old man began to weep. Now it happened that in the group was the very man who had killed the other merchant. "Where did it happen, Daddy?" he said. "When and in what month?" He asked all about it, and his heart began to ache. So he comes up to the old man like this and falls down at his feet. "You are perishing because of me, Daddy," he says. "It's quite true, lads, that this man," he says, "is being tortured innocently, and for nothing. He says, "I did that deed. I put the knife under your head while you were asleep. Forgive me, Daddy," he says, "for Christ's sake." Kretiev paused, smiling joyously as he gazed into the fire, and he drew the logs together. And the old man said, "God will forgive you. We are all sinners in his sight. I suffer for my own sins." And he wept bitter tears. "Well, and what do you think, dear friends?" Kretiev continued, his face brightening more and more with a rapturous smile, as if what he now had to tell contained the chief charm of the whole meaning of his story. "What do you think, dear fellows? That murderer confessed to the authorities. 'I have taken 6 lives, he says. He was a great sinner. But what I am most sorry for is this old man. Don't let him suffer because of me.' So he confessed, and it was all written down, and the paper sent off in due form. The place was a very long way off, and while they were judging, what with one thing and another, filling in the papers all in due form, the authorities, I mean, time passed. The affair reached the Tsar. After a while, the Tsar's decree came, to set the merchant free and give him compensation that he had been awarded. The paper arrived, and they began to look for the old man. "Where is the old man who has been suffering innocently and in vain? The paper has come from the Tsar." So they began looking for him. Here Kretiev's lower jaw trembled. But God had already forgiven him. He was dead. "That's how it was, dear fellows," Kretiev concluded, and sat for a long time silent, gazing before him with a smile. And Pierre's soul was dimly but joyfully filled, not by the story itself, but by its mysterious significance, by the rapturous joy that lit up Kretiev's face as he told it, and the mystic significance of that joy. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 307. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 307. A Sovereignty Ancient. Past the midnight hour, along a chilly Russian roadside strewn with decomposing animals, human and horses alike, Pierre Bezukhov joins a campfire to enjoy the warm, pleasant storytelling of Platon Kretiev. Platon has no business being pleasant. His fever is still with him, though subdued. He speaks feebly. His body is withering away, and, let's face it, a wartime death march isn't typically an event one associates with good cheer. Yet, that abiding spark of amenity animates from within the good man's heart. The story he tells is actually a favorite of Tolstoy's. He published it later, after fully fleshing it out, under the title God Sees the Truth, but Waits, and considered it to be one of the few stories he ever wrote that satisfied his high artistic standards. It is a story about forgiveness. It begins with 2 traveling merchants. The merchants rest one night at an inn where, under cover of darkness, one of them is murdered. The murder weapon, a knife, is placed under the pillow of the surviving party. The innocent survivor is convicted of murder and sentenced to hard labor in Siberia. He endures his unjust punishment, and many years later, one of his fellow prisoners, a convicted murderer, upon hearing the wronged one's story, tearfully and regretfully confesses that he is actually the murderer and begs the merchant's forgiveness. The merchant forgives him. The process of the merchant's exoneration and release is set in motion, but it's too late. He dies as he lived, in prison. While the subject of this parable, forgiveness, may inspire Pierre at a later date, today it's more Platon's telling of the story that heartens him. We're speaking here of Platon's general disposition, his aforementioned pleasantness. Platon's cheeriness is something we've witnessed since his introduction. Today, Tolstoy draws our attention to it multiple times. Platon is described as having happy light in his eyes. At chapter's end, Pierre reflects on Platon's storytelling, and Pierre's soul was dimly but joyfully filled, Tolstoy writes. Not by the story itself, but by its mysterious significance, by the rapturous joy that lit up Karatyev's face as he told it, and the mystic significance of that joy. Platon Karatyev emerges as Pierre's great teacher in War and Peace. But it's not necessarily Platon's wisdom that draws Pierre's attention. It's more his pleasant personality. For when deeds and words are wreathed in grace, favor, and liberality, their sweetness attracts an eager ear. Daily meditation. My first counsel is this: possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, that thine may be a sovereignty ancient, imperishable, and everlasting. Baha'u'llah, The Hidden Words. All right, that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 307 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that is down in the description. Also down there in the description, you'll find links to my Amazon wish list for books and movies. If you decide to support me by purchasing one of those, we'll set up a Zoom call so we can talk about that book or the movie. Your support in any event is greatly appreciated. Tomorrow, we are going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 308. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.